What I wanted to talk to you guys about today was the light and fluffy subject of web sustainability. So it's not going to be all doom and gloom, don't worry. But it's about why as developers our kind of choices really matter in what we're doing. So let's kind of crack on and see if I can actually manage to do it in 10 minutes. So this is me, that's my face. It's hairier than it is now, but with less hair on the side because haircuts are a thing that are difficult to do. I'm a consultant developer and a technical architect. I work a lot in the content management web space, and I'm also a MVP for Kentico Content, which is a headless CMS. Hence, I work with CMSs quite a bit. That's my Twitter down there if you want to kind of follow me on Twitter or see what I'm rambling on about. So as I kind of said, I've done a lot of CMS stuff. I've worked in the web industry since sort of like 99 or something like that. I've done a lot of CMS platforms. And for those people who know me, I have a slight eco streak. I like the environment, as hopefully most of us do. My wife runs an eco store in our local town, and this is one of the things that led to this talk was a conversation I had with my wife about how much energy goes into storing the, at the time, tens of thousands of unread emails she had in her Gmail box, which was astonishing. And it kind of got me thinking, well, all of these things we kind of do online, what is the impact of it? So what is the actual problem that I'm kind of trying to address here? The problem is the emissions of everything we kind of do online. We don't think about it. We pick up our phone, we watch, I don't know, high definition Peppa Pig with our kids. There's no smoke pouring out of our phone to let us know there's any emissions going on, unless you're unfortunate enough to have maybe one of the Samsungs that had a few issues a few years back. But generally, we just kind of pick it up, we watch the device, and we get on with stuff. But all of the things we're doing, they're all using power, and we need to be kind of a little bit more aware, certainly as developers when we're creating things, so specifically for people like me working in the web, that what we produce consumes power, and that power has emissions, and we need to be more aware of that. This is a kind of thing where Greta's going to want us to panic about this, and we probably should a little bit more, but we can make some choices that can make this a little bit better in the long run. So another thing that kind of sparked this conversation was a conversation I had with someone in the pub, after one of our meetups. What feels like a couple of years ago, and I think it might have been Daniel I had this conversation with, but we were talking about how much power an Echo Dot uses. So Amazon Alexa, what does it do? It sat there all day, kind of consuming electricity, listening for me to talk about cat food so that it can advertise cat food to me. Turns out they use 3 watts, which isn't a lot. Over a year, that's 22 kilowatt hours. That's okay. That's not so bad. And it's around about 5 kilos of CO2 over the space of a year, which doesn't seem massive, right? I've got 4 of these guys in my house. So that's now 20 kilos. So, okay, that's not much, but this kind of adds up and adds up. And all these other IoT devices we have and the phones we use and the websites we visit, they all consume more and more power, and they transmit more and more data just to kind of make our lives that little bit more convenient. This is kind of where we're at now. Everyone's familiar with this view, looking at a Zoom video, talking to your colleagues and friends and family. This is what life has become for us. And this whole talk is not supposed to be about the pandemic and about 2020, but it certainly had quite a big impact on what we're doing. 2020, there was a virus, there was a pandemic. We all started working from home. And basically, a study by Yale at the end of last year, which they published in January this year, shows us that we a 40% increase in internet usage globally during the pandemic, and let's call it 43 million megawatt hours, give or take a few, of extra electricity to deal with this. And that's a phenomenal amount of stuff, and that trend's set to continue a little bit more because we're all, to a degree, happy to be remote working. So the problem with all of that is it's the data that we're using. Everything we use and everything we do has a cost. So those tens of thousands of emails that lie unread on Google in your inbox or that you've archived away, They're still there. They're still stored. They're sat in a data center somewhere. That data center needs cooling. Every time you look at your inbox and Google wants to tell you how many unread emails you're using, some compute power happens that uses some power. That data then needs to be transmitted from Oregon to, I don't know, Whitney, wherever you're based, to tell you all of that information. This all uses power and it has more emissions. And we kind of don't think about it, especially the data that's at rest, stuff you're not using, all of that stuff in your OneDrive that you access once a month. Typically, when you call looking at a report by HP, they reckon that only about 6% of the data that is stored online is actually accessed regularly. The rest of it might as well be in landfill. It's not really used anymore. So we need to be aware of all this data. I'm now going to show you a slide where I didn't quite get it right, but it's fine. Streaming, okay? We're streaming a 4K video. On this instance, I've got someone using what's clearly a Mac, but the logo's been edited out there. You watch the 4K video, if you haven't got a screen that's big enough for you to notice it, you're using 8 times the emissions to stream that video that you could be if you were watching it in standard definition. And it's just a tiny, tiny, tiny little thing. But we do this on web pages. We'll load a video, we'll put it up at 3 times resolution for a Retina display screen, and someone that doesn't necessarily need that level of data. The tsunami of information we do have, we're using close to 20% of global electricity used in communications. So this is the kind of stuff that a lot of us work in. I think I read somewhere, and I'll need to go and find the link. The communications industry has surpassed the aviation industry now. Not too hard for last year because no one was flying anywhere, but it's still a huge amount of data to be shuffling around and a huge amount of power that we're using, and we just need to be that little bit more careful. If we look at what we're doing and then we continue the trend we're on, I think you can read the top point yourself, but we need to plant a lot of trees to offset all of this extra power we're using. And twice the size of Portugal. If you're in the States, I think that's like Oklahoma or North Dakota or something. That's that kind of size of land worth of forest that we are consuming the carbon from. So there's kind of a lot going on. This slide really spoke to me quite a bit when I did this research. Okay, you do a Google search. We all do this quite a lot. That's kind of how most of us probably do our jobs a little bit. 0.2 to 1 grams of CO2 for each search we do. Doesn't seem like a lot. But you multiply it out when you've got 35 billion searches every day, and you get 700 tons of CO2 just on Google. And that's a phenomenal number. Now, if you kind of think of that as solid blocks of CO2, that's 16 Eddie Stobart trucks on the motorway full of CO2 just from one day's worth of Google searches, which is, it's quite a big amount. Need to be careful with that number a little bit because I do know that Google have been carbon neutral. So this covers maybe more of an assumption than anything else, but it's still going to be a pretty big number when you include the way that we're transmitting the data around. So I guess the question is, what can we do about it? And this is the bit where our choices come in. So, we can look at our hosting, we can look at static sites and content delivery networks, and generally just kind of reducing our bandwidth. Hosting is a really big one. The sort of the main providers are all making some really good headway on being carbon neutral. So just changing your provider to someone who's committed to being more neutral on their emissions is a great start. Google, AWS, Microsoft, all doing really, really well. I know Microsoft, for example, they have an aim to offset literally all of their carbon emissions going back to 75 by the year 2050, which will be an interesting one if they manage to do it. But I think they're planning to be carbon negative by 2030. So that's an awesome step. We can try to influence which hosting providers we use, and we can try to potentially even influence them as well. We can also do less, which is a big one, as I kind of briefly touched on earlier on. If we're going to be building websites, like how often does your content actually change? Do you need to dynamically render the page every time with a little bit of cache here and there, or can you actually get away with producing most of your site with a static web app where 90% or more of your content is just rendered once every so often, and then we use web services and service architectures to actually deliver the relevant dynamic content. Um, we can look at local delivery, which is nothing to do with Waitrose or Ricardo, but actually setting up with the content delivery networks. So if you've got a static site and if you've got assets, pushing them out to a content delivery network that's closer to the people who are getting that content is going to reduce the amount of emissions for just delivering that content to them. And obviously streaming less, using less bandwidth, cut down on unnecessary video, which I realise is slightly ironic because I've got lots of video playing in the background on my presentation. But we can reduce what we're using here, and it doesn't have to be a terrible kind of Times New Roman text on a grey background to deliver a website if you want to use less bandwidth. There are things we can do to reduce the image sizes, like using modern web formats, WebP versus JPEG, etc. So there's a lot we can really do to just cut down what we're doing, make things a little bit better on the whole. So, and that's kind of it. I don't want to doom and gloom everyone. We just need to be a bit more conscious of where we're at and how we're doing things. I will provide Dan with lots and lots of links. I got lost preparing this, just reading a lot of stuff. So there's oodles of content to go through if you want to know more about it and how you can work with making things better. But that's me. So thank you very much for listening to me waffle on. I will now pass you on to a man who normally doesn't need much of an introduction and has a habit of making people who listen to his talks really rather hungry by talking about food. So over to you, Simon.